Here's something most drivers in Virginia don't realize. You can be arrested for a cannabis DUI even when no chemical test confirms THC impairment. In those situations, officers don't rely on numbers at all. They rely on a structured drug recognition expert evaluation, made up of specific, documented indicators. And what's tricky, what most people never hear clearly explained, is how those indicators actually work in Virginia, how they're interpreted by courts, and which ones quietly carry the most legal weight. Because the outcome doesn't depend on one sign. It depends on how all of them line up together. We're going to break those indicators down step by step, but first, you need to understand why this system exists in the first place. Open legal loop preserved, no breath test, outcome still unresolved. Here's the counterintuitive legal fact or misconception. Most people assume that without a THC breathalyzer, proving cannabis impairment must be difficult, or at least rare. But in Virginia, the absence of a chemical threshold didn't slow enforcement down. It reshaped it. Instead of relying on a single measurement, the law leans on a series of observable indicators: eye response, vital signs, coordination, and cognitive performance, interpreted by a trained drug recognition expert. And that matters, because that matters legally, since these indicators are treated as expert evidence, not casual observation. Let's challenge a belief that most of us likely hold. A belief many drivers hold is that officers need to prove cannabis impairment using hard science, numbers, lab results, or measurable THC levels. But under Virginia law, impairment isn't defined that way. More accurately, impairment is defined by how a substance affects a person's ability to drive safely, as demonstrated through observable indicators. That distinction, chemistry versus performance, is where most misunderstandings start. And it's also where many cases are decided. Now, welcome to Norfolk, Virginia Cannabis Hub, where we focus on Virginia-specific cannabis law, local governance, and regulatory clarity, so residents, business owners, and communities understand what the law actually says, not just what headlines suggest. In this video, we're focusing specifically on Virginia Cannabis DUI DRE Indicators, what each indicator is, how it's evaluated, and why certain indicators carry more legal significance than others. This is not guidance on consumption, not advice on avoiding enforcement, and not a debate about legalization. This is a legal explanation of how impairment is assessed when no THC breath test exists. And as we move through these indicators, keep in mind the unresolved issue we opened with, how enforcement reaches a conclusion without chemical proof, because that question only becomes clear once we see how the indicators work together. Here's the context. So, why does this legal issue exist at all? Virginia legalized adult possession, but it did not legalize impaired driving. At the same time, Virginia does not recognize a per se THC limit like alcohol's 0.08 standard. That gap created a problem for enforcement and prosecution. Lawmakers and courts needed a method to assess impairment without relying on a numeric threshold. This is where the Drug Recognition Expert Program enters the picture. It's a nationally standardized, 12-step evaluation originally designed for multiple drug categories, not just cannabis. And because cannabis affects individuals differently, more accurately, inconsistently, it became the preferred enforcement tool in Virginia. Confusion is common because legalization changed possession rules, but not impairment standards. Those two things moved on separate tracks, and most public discussion never bridged the gap. Here's the legal explanation. Under Virginia law, impairment is evaluated based on whether a substance affects a person's ability to operate a motor vehicle safely. There's no requirement that impairment be quantified chemically. Instead, officers may rely on trained observation, standardized testing, and expert interpretation. The DRE process evaluates multiple indicators across the nervous system. Eye response, vital signs, muscle tone, coordination, and cognitive processing are all assessed together. Not individually, together. Let me rephrase that, because it matters. No single indicator proves impairment on its own. The legal theory is that consistency across indicators establishes impairment. Indicators are often emphasized. DREs assess pupil size under different lighting, the ability to smoothly track moving objects, and signs like rebound dilation. With cannabis, pupils may appear dilated, but not always. And that variability is important later, especially in court. Pulse rate is measured multiple times. Elevated or inconsistent pulse readings can be interpreted as central nervous system stimulation. Tremors, hand or body tremors, are noted visually, not instrumentally. Divided attention tasks assess whether a person can follow instructions while performing physical actions under cognitive load. Odor detection is included, but, this is critical, odor alone does not establish impairment. It's considered contextual. Muscle tone and general demeanor are also evaluated, particularly whether the subject appears rigid, relaxed, confused, or unusually slow. The key legal concept here is convergence. The law looks for alignment across observations, not precision within any single test. How enforcement works. Now, here's where enforcement mechanics change the stakes. Local and state law enforcement conduct traffic stops. If impairment is suspected and alcohol is ruled out or insufficient to explain behavior, a DRE may be called in. Not every officer is a DRE. Certification requires extensive training, and their testimony is treated as expert evidence. Complaints and investigations don't begin with lab results. They begin with behavior. Driving patterns, response times, speech patterns, and compliance with instructions initiate the process. Lab reports, when they exist, are not determinative. That's worth repeating, because that matters legally. THC presence does not equal impairment under Virginia law. And absence of THC does not necessarily negate observed impairment if other indicators align. And this brings us closer to the unresolved issue we opened with, but not quite yet. Who this affects. Consumers are affected first. Legal possession can coexist with illegal operation of a vehicle. Those concepts are separate, and the law treats them separately. Retailers are affected indirectly. Public misunderstanding of impairment standards feeds consumer behavior, which in turn affects enforcement patterns and public scrutiny. Local governments, especially in Hampton Roads and Norfolk, must navigate enforcement consistency while responding to public safety concerns. The medical cannabis framework is affected differently. Certification does not provide immunity from impairment enforcement. Medical status may be considered context, but it does not override DUI standards. Each group operates under the same impairment definition, even if their legal relationship to cannabis differs. Why this matters? This matters for public safety, because impairment standards are designed to prevent harm, not to measure chemistry. It matters for regulatory clarity, because vague understanding leads to misplaced confidence. It matters legally and financially, because DUI convictions carry penalties that extend far beyond fines, license suspension, insurance consequences, and employment impact. And long-term, this shapes policy. How DRE evidence is treated today influences whether Virginia eventually adopts new testing standards, or doubles down on observation-based enforcement. Now, this is the point where most people think they understand how this plays out. But this is where the most important clarification begins. Here's a scenario. Earlier, I mentioned that the lack of a THC breath test creates a specific enforcement outcome. This is where that issue becomes clear. Imagine a Norfolk driver stopped for a minor traffic infraction. No alcohol is detected. The driver admits to legal cannabis use earlier in the day. A DRE conducts an evaluation. Eye indicators show lack of smooth pursuit. Pulse is elevated twice. The driver struggles with divided attention tasks. No blood test confirms impairment. No THC threshold is exceeded. But the indicators align. Under Virginia law, that alignment supports a DUI charge. Now contrast that with a second scenario. Same admission. Same stop. But eye indicators are normal. Pulse is elevated once, normal twice. Divided attention tasks are performed correctly. Odor is present, but demeanor is calm and responsive. Here, the convergence fails. And that small legal distinction, the consistency of indicators, changes everything. That's the silent legal question answered. Not whether cannabis was used, but whether impairment was established through convergence. What to watch next? If this topic matters to you, the next legal layer involves how DRE testimony is challenged in Virginia courts, and which indicators tend to carry the most evidentiary weight. Here's a question to think about. Which DRE indicator do you think courts rely on most heavily when no chemical test exists, and why? So, here's the takeaway. Virginia Cannabis DUI DRE indicators are not about proving cannabis use. They're about proving impairment through structured observation. That distinction, use versus impairment, is where most misunderstandings begin and where most legal consequences unfold. If this helped clarify how Virginia law actually works, consider liking the video, subscribing for future legal breakdowns, and joining the Norfolk City Cannabis Community to continue the discussion in a compliance-focused space.